shows. It's straight up 12 noon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference Series. It's continuing today, featuring Dr. Joe Pankowski discussing his new approach to mycotoxin mitigation. The Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference presents the latest research on nutrition and management of dairy cattle and has expanded the conference impact on the industry with this webinar series. The conference and webinars are a collaborative effort of Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, University of Illinois Extension, University of Minnesota Extension, and the University of Wisconsin Extension. Dr. Pankowski's presentation, Mycotoxin Mitigation, a New Approach, describes mycotoxins that can be formed on crops in the field during harvest or during storage, processing, or feeding. In a global survey, 85% of cereal grains sampled were contaminated with at least one mycotoxin. The threat of mycotoxins also exists in silage. Ruminants are susceptible to the detrimental effect of mycotoxins in the diet, meaning that your herd's production and performance and ultimately your profitability could be taking a hit. Dr. Pankowski joined and Hammer Technical Services in 2011, and currently he leads and manages a team of PhD and DVM multi-species technical service managers that provide technical expertise to the field sales team, key influences, and producers in the Americas. He received his BS and MS degrees from The Ohio State University and then went on to earn his PhD in dairy management from Cornell. As I always say, Dr. Pankowski, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate the opportunity. As Fred mentioned, we're going to talk about a new approach, something different and innovative that basically came about through conversations we had with nutritionists and solutions that we can provide at Arm & Hammer. So I'm going to kill my camera to make sure that I don't freeze this up, and we'll get started. You probably, you might have been caught by the title, but at the end of the day, you're wondering, is this going to be a good return on your time investment? So really what the purpose today is to build your knowledge base and increase your comfort level relative to mycotoxins and what the detrimental effects are, and some strategies that we're starting to see that are new and innovative to help cows overcome them. We're going to look through some peer-reviewed research that illustrates that specifically refined functional carbohydrates have a very good role in protecting the gut epithelial cells from mycotoxin. And then at the end, hopefully, we'll be able to eliminate any of the marketplace confusion that you see, allow for better understanding of how mycotoxin mitigation, those options can be objectively evaluated, and give you and I a process where you can take a look at and identify research-proven, field-tested opportunities. Ultimately, the goal, as Fred mentioned, was healthier cows, better productivity, and ultimately better profitability. So before we start, let's get level grounded. What are mycotoxins? Everybody, we'll start with this conversation. Essentially, what we're talking about this afternoon is the toxic secondary metabolites that are produced by fungi. Okay, that would grow on. Typically, they would grow on grains, but they also grow on forages. Also, you would find that they have a direct and indirect impact on productivity, both in livestock and poultry. So they can negatively impact both cattle, swine, and poultry relative to productivity. They're formed on crops, as I mentioned, in the field, but even our best managers in harvesting, we do everything right. We still can't prevent 100% that we're not going to see it these fungi form and mycotoxins being produced during the harvest or storage phases, or even processing and feeding out of these feeds. Presently, as we mentioned earlier, there's more than 85% of the grains worldwide are positive for at least one mycotoxin. And so it's a pretty big opportunity for us to take a look at this as a mitigation opportunity. And it's even more of a challenge in the dairy industry because the threat also exists in our silages. And I'll show you research that indicates that there's an additive effect of multiple mycotoxins in a diet. In other words, it's more acute than just having a single mycotoxin present. So this is a survey that the DSM puts out every year. It's actually a quite comprehensive survey. It takes a look at mycotoxin presence throughout the world, wherever they were sampled. Obviously, you take a look at this map, it's color-coded. The gray areas, those samples were submitted. Suffice it to say, the darker the red or maroon, the worse the contamination was for the sample submitted. So these were individual feed samples and then also total mixed feeds also. Obviously, the levels of specific mycotoxins are going to vary by region, by climate, by weather pattern, but we're looking at almost 12,000 samples, almost 60,000 analyses run worldwide. If you just take a look at North America, for instance, you can see that we've got quite a few samples tested, almost 1,100 samples. We're taking a look at all the different opportunities in livestock from a productivity standpoint, from poultry to swine, dairy, aquaculture, and shrimp. Those have become a little more prevalent, maybe not so much in the U.S., but definitely in Canada and South America. But you can see that the ones that are of primary concern shouldn't surprise any of us in the dairy industry. Zearalenone, DON, and fumonisin. Those have been a nemesis to us for quite some time, and again, this survey shows us that that's fairly consistent with present day. If we take a look at Latin America, similar breakout and distribution. Zearalenone, fumonisin, and DON seem to be the top three in that region also. And again, if we're looking at the dairy industry in particular, between Canada, the U.S., Mexico, Brazil, those would be areas where, high numbers of dairy animals. And again, the challenges are very similar. So even though there's differences in management, differences in countries, differences in languages, we all have some commonality here relative to the mycotoxin challenge. I mentioned earlier about this whole idea of an additive effect. This data comes out of that survey, and it's actually consistent with published data in the Journal of Dairy Science over the last 15, 20 years. If you look at the risk of co-contamination with more than one mycotoxin in a feed sample, very few samples come back under the detection limit, about 10%, whereas over 70% usually come back with more than one mycotoxin. This is a specific call out to the nutritionists. Occasionally we'll get these reports and it says they'll have a 0 in the column where mycotoxin. It doesn't mean that the feed sample is totally clean of mycotoxins. It just means that there wasn't enough there to detect it. So it was below the level of detection. So what's the end result in these livestock, whether we're talking dairy cattle or the other species? Essentially, it's all the same across the species. It's intestinal destruction, or what we would call cytotoxicity. And it's very synergistic with the presence of more than one mycotoxin. So in other words, this data would make the case, I'll go through the data in a second, but the Cliff Note version of the data or the summary bullet points would be: an animal can tolerate a high level of one mycotoxin much better than it can tolerate a lower level of multiple mycotoxins. So if you take a look going from left to right in our first series of 3 bars, you can see that we have OTA and fumonisin at both at lower levels, and you can see that the reduction in cell viability is less for each individual one than it is when they're combined at the similar dose, that black bar. Okay, and then when we increase the level of fumonisin, you can see that we get an additive effect across the board. It's somewhat linear. So again, this whole idea that there's a synergistic effect and these mycotoxins can work in tandem or triplet to create even more intestinal destruction than any one can on its own. Big debate currently going on in the industry is testing. We got to test everything. Test, find out what we have, what's the load, how much is there, trying to predict the mycotoxin load, but it's very difficult to do. You can see here, this is just a depiction of sampling on a pile of corn, different mycotoxin loads from different sample points. So there's a lot of sampling error involved in this. It has to do with the points in time where the forages or the grains were harvested. There's pockets within fields. There's pockets within regions. So even though there's no evidence of mycotoxins occasionally, for instance, in that one triangle there, it says it's got a level 2, very low level. It's probably a good insurance policy to have a mitigation strategy. And I know people don't like to hear the word insurance, but because that implies investment. But I guess I'd offer that given the fact, and this is a fact, it's a publishable fact that mycotoxins exist in these feeds. If that's the reality we're dealing with, then obviously we have to do something to counter that or mitigate that. And it's basically not so much an additional cost, it's a cost of doing business and increasing our chances of being profitable. So effects, what are these detrimental effects that we talk about? Well, I highlighted the popular mycotoxins that tend to be impacting the dairy industry to a high degree. Aflatoxin, DON, zearalenone. Got aflatoxin highlighted because that is one where there's zero tolerance in milk for sure. You'll get a load of milk rejected even at the lowest levels of aflatoxin. So if we have mycotoxins present in our feeds, we tend to see oxidative stress and tissue damage. Gut integrity is reduced, and the permeability of that gut wall is increased. So in other words, there's gaps or holes in that tight junction area of the gut. Now picture, if you will, the gut being a long PVC pipe, a solid pipe. It's not supposed to have dings and dents and cracks in it. If we do that, then we keep things in the pipe that are supposed to be in there, and we keep things out of the pipe that are supposed to be out of there. But when we have mycotoxins, they tend to damage that gut. They can cause migration to the organs, and then there'll be secondary infections that ensue. This suppresses immunity, and ultimately performance is detrimental. It has a detrimental impact on performance. So again, the goal is to keep that pipe as sturdy as possible, free of dings and dents, and we have to talk about ways now to move forward and deal with these mycotoxins because they are present whether we want to admit it or not. So our approach actually came about through talking to nutritionists. We often get asked to look at diets across the U.S. or across the Americas. The team that Fred mentioned that I lead coordinates technical services in all species from Canada through South America. So oftentimes nutritionists will contact us to evaluate diets, and we tend to see a couple things in common throughout that whole region. They tend to have three, I guess what I'll call product lines in their rations to help with gut health. They tend to usually have a yeast culture or a live yeast type product in there. They'll have some type of a moss or a pathogen mitigator in there for pathogen mitigation. And then they'll have some type of a mycotoxin mitigator, whether it's something crude like just a straight aluminum silicate or a bentonite type product, or or something that would be tailored more towards an advanced beta glucan type thing. So ideally, those products on the mycotoxin in the product sector have all been, up to this point, designed to prevent the negative effects of mycotoxins. So in other words, they will help the animal to resist that detrimental impact by binding. Okay, they'll use a process of binding or making or somehow deactivating the mycotoxin. There's basically binding options out there, and there's other solutions that are based on enzymatic processes. Some are very targeted. So if you have the issue that solution targets, you'll see great success. If you don't, you won't. Others are more broad spectrum in nature. So we've taken this to the next level where we absolutely need to prevent or reduce that mycotoxin load in the gut through some sort of mitigation. But when we've taken it to what we think is the next level based on the needs that were the unmet needs of the nutritionists that we talked to. They said, hey, can you come up with something that would protect the gut wall in combination with binding these mycotoxins? We're not going to bind them all, so can we do something to sturdy up that pipe and prevent the dings and dents? And so we've got a technology in our portfolio that allows us to get an inside-out protection of that and reduce gut cytology. I'll show you some research on that. And then at the end of the day, we build resilience. If we can prevent and protect, we'll build resilience in these animals and prepare them for any other unseen challenges. So for instance, if you fall left or right, if we can bind mycotoxins and keep the gut sturdy, if an animal gets an insult of pathogen, say she ingests salmonella that came in on cottonseed, or coliforms from any type of a manure contamination at the TMR level, that animal's more resilient to that challenge than she would be if the mycotoxins had damaged that gut and made that gut open to insult. So I'm going to talk to you about a technology that we branded BG Max, but it's essentially a combination of our refined functional carbohydrates, which are unique to Arm & Hammer, and a specifically processed and specially processed, highly found bentonite, highly ground bentonite. That combination, this product then can go after the prevent and protect. Just briefly on the refined functional carbohydrates, the type of molecular size that are produced through our enzymatic hydrolysis are specifically determined for this product through our special yeast, our specific yeast strain that we produce. And that's really important because we're the only company in the world that uses enzymatic hydrolysis to harvest the yeast cell wall components. You'll hear other people say they do. You'll hear other people tell you that they've got the same thing cheaper. But every time we run those competitive analyses, we come back with not exactly the true story. These products that are made through the enzymatic hydrolysis process are highly bioactive. They have great surface area, and they're decoupled from each other to be bioactive. So in other words, 90% of the products manufactured in the yeast sector use a process, basically what we call mechanical processing, where they'll take the yeast cell wall, blow it through a fine screen to shatter that wall. So yes, they do have all the major cell wall components in that finished product. However, they're not as bioactive as an enzymatically hydrolyzed yeast cell wall. For instance, when you blow that cell wall through the sieve or screen, you still could have a piece of beta glucan attached to a piece of moss. If that's the case, which oftentimes it is, those are both not bioactive. So the beta glucan can't do anything to help the gut wall, and the moss cannot agglutinate to any type of salmonella or coli. At Arm & Hammer, we avoid all of that by introducing a specific enzyme at a specific time point to strip off a specific piece of that cell wall and then siphon that off. And then in this particular solution, we siphon it off and we combine it with our bentonite that's specifically processed for us to make this solution. So how does this solution prevent? Well, it does come at mycotoxins through the traditional method of binding. Okay, so it will bind mycotoxins present in feed, and it'll help reduce any damage that they would do in the host, whether that's a chicken or a dairy cow. But the drawback to this is, again, this is the industry standard so far, but the drawback here is none of these binders that are offered on the market can bind all the mycotoxins. Okay, so there's still going to be free flow of mycotoxins available even after we expose them to a binder. So data here to show efficiency of mycotoxin absorption with the solution. We prevent mycotoxins from causing any damage to the host or being absorbed. These are the commonly seen mycotoxins that I showed you in the survey, and you can see that almost 100% absorption to aflatoxin, and as you look at some of the other major ones, zearalenone over 80%, ochratoxin, fumonisin again well over 50%. So I leave the Dawn table on the table only because to show that there's efficacy there, but it's marginal. There really isn't anything out there that's as highly effective against Dawn as what you'd see here with zearalenone or aflatoxin or fumonisin and so on. So beware when you hear that, because that solution is yet to be found. Dawn is still a tricky one. Protection. Now this is where our solution at Arm & Hammer goes beyond what the industry standard is right now, the binding process. So any of these unbound mycotoxins that didn't get bound by our binding component, they still pose a threat, as I mentioned, in the gut. So we can work inside out to protect the gut epithelial surface from this damage by blocking the transfer of those mycotoxins to the gut, from the gut to the organs, and protect against multiple mycotoxins. So again, I mentioned some of these products are binding in nature, some are enzymatic in nature. The enzymatic ones tend to be very focused. They're not broad spectrum. So again, if you have what they're focused on, you're going to do well. If you don't, they probably are not going to show you a good result. So this technology will allow you to both broad spectrumly bind and then also shore up that PVC pipe, make sure there's no dings, dents. This unique cytotoxicity ability makes this the only solution out on the market right now that can protect the animal from inside out. So how can we say that? Well, I'll show you some science behind it. This whole idea of protection basically comes down to cytology scoring, to take a look at and evaluate gut epithelial cells that have been exposed to mycotoxins and see how damaged they really are. It's a pretty simple test. It's very well accepted in the scientific community. Essentially, if you go back to your days in microbiology, you most likely did this at your undergraduate microbiology class, or you may have even done it in your high school advanced biology. But you take a toxin and expose it to an epithelial cell. After about 4 hours, you wash those with a methyl solution and stain with the blue tryptin dye. And what happens? Well, I'm going to start on the left in the dead center of the screen. That control, that cell control right there has a cytology score of 0. So that plate had 0. We know it was 0 mycotoxin exposure, okay? And you can see the epithelial cells are very, very much alive, and there's a huge uptake of that blue tryptin dye. So the bottom line is live cells suck up that dye, lots of dark color. Now I want to go all the way to the right. If you take a look at that plate at the right, you're going to see fumonisin at 100 parts per million has been introduced to that epithelial cell culture. And we would then score that after washing and exposing the dye at a cytology score of 3. Okay, you can see a lot of white space there. There are still some live cells, but very few. So again, dead cells don't pick up the dye. We got a lot of damage there. Now let's go back to the middle. When we take that another plate of epithelial cells, expose them to fumonisin at 100 parts per million, and then also expose them simultaneously to our refined functional carbohydrates, you can see there, very little damage. Score of 1. There is some zones of damage, but very, very, very minimal compared to non-exposure with the refined functional carbohydrates. So again, those refined functional carbohydrates, their bioactivity intervenes to help with that, shore up those gut epithelial tissues and dramatically reduce cell damage. So how does that show up in the animal? Well, if we take a look at, protecting that epithelium from mycotoxin damage, the first graphic on the left is actually from a paper that was written by a researcher at Ag Canada, independent research that the Canadian government sponsored to look at the efficacy of products that claim to have mycotoxin mitigation properties. If you take a look at the cytology scoring, they use the same scoring method that I just detailed a minute ago, and look at the reduction in epithelial damage in the presence of our refined functional carbohydrates, you can see that dramatic reduction in when the refined functional carbohydrates are introduced. We go from scores of 3, pretty much for 4 out of the 6, to down to a score of almost a 0, so pretty much close to a control. Again, really, really limiting the amount of cytotoxicity that these mycotoxins can level at an epithelial tissue. If you look at a more recent study, 10 years later, the vertical is a little different. They looked at the percent of cytotoxicity, okay? The effects of treatments relative to a control with our refined functional carbohydrate solution. Again, you're looking at 83% cell damage on the first mycotoxin with no mitigator present. With our refined functional carbohydrates introduced, we take that down to about a 4%. And the same trend holds for aflatoxin and fumonisin. One of the other components of that Ag Canada study was taking a look at products on the market in Canada at the time that made those types of claims and their efficacy to prevent damage to these cells. So again, they looked at, in this particular experiment, they looked at aflatoxin, fumonisin, and T2. As you can see, the refined functional carbohydrates from Arm & Hammer outperformed some of the other industry offerings by a long shot. So again, it goes back to that intensity of manufacturing and being totally related to the bioactivity of the cell wall components that you're feeding the cow. Now, how does this happen? Well, again, this gets into for those on the webinar that are really getting into the science. This is, I guess, what some of my team would call the gearhead stuff. If you take a look at this protection, if we look at treatments on intestinal barrier function, our solution's been shown, and this is just one research paper where we've improved expression of intestinal barrier function proteins. So specifically, what we're looking at is intestinal barrier function proteins. Okay, they play a key role in maintaining gut integrity and permeability. We provided them a mixed mycotoxin challenge, and then we supplemented them with BG Max to see what happens. So again, we'll go from left to right. In a controlled diet, you can see when we have a mixed mycotoxin challenge and no mitigation. I'm sorry, in a controlled diet where we have no mycotoxin challenge, you can see that there's pretty high levels of the intestinal barrier function proteins, okay? Those levels are dramatically reduced when we introduce mycotoxins to the diet in a mixed mycotoxin challenge. When we take that same mycotoxin challenge and add our BG Max to it, we can recoup some of that barrier function. We don't get back to quite control, but at 75 to 80th percentile, it's still much far superior to not doing anything to mitigate these mycotoxins. So this intestinal barrier function protein thing is pretty important as an indicator of gut permeability. The higher these intestinal barrier proteins are, the less permeable the gut is. We've actually shown we can protect at a farm level by limiting the translocation of aflatoxin from the gut to the milk. Okay, these are two dairies, both in Pennsylvania, both large dairies. They both got shut off from their milk supplier because of aflatoxin contamination. When we intervened with the Arm & Hammer solution, you can see that just in a matter of days, we were able to get these guys back to shipping milk. Okay, we looked at the percent of cows screened for aflatoxin positive by roughly day 5, day 6. Depending on the severity of the load, obviously, we got one back to operating at day 5, one at day 7. Interestingly enough, I don't remember which dairy it was, but one of these dairies decided after about 6 months to stop with the intervention because they thought they were through the worst of it, so to speak. And within a matter of 48 hours, they were shut off again. Okay, kind of did a rough epidemiological investigation on the dairy in conjunction with the nutritionist, and what we found was it was coming in on the corn. The aflatoxin actually was coming in on corn, and we couldn't even tell if it was corn from the dairy because it was coming from a local co-op where the corn that they were providing their customers was corn banks. So it could have been theirs, it could have been their neighbor's problem. But again, pretty effective. And then this is very visual to the producer. Trust me, when they're dumping tanker loads into manure pits, and then all of a sudden within a week they can start shipping milk, it makes a serious impact. So the last of our conversation, the R and PPR, you know, what does that really do? What does a solution do to increase resilience? Well, we've reduced that mycotoxin burden first by binding, the prevention, and then by protecting through increasing those gut barrier proteins in the epithelial. And so what does that mean? Well, when we prevent and we protect, it reduces both the primary and secondary challenges of mycotoxins. So we can now protect against opportunistic pathogens that will colonize and infect those open wounds caused by the mycotoxins. We'll have a better health in our gut epithelium for better feed assimilation. So in other words, you get more out of the nutrients you're putting in. We can restore that immunosuppression. I showed you data there where and I'll show you another piece of data to support that. It keeps those animals protected from infection. And then we can improve productivity and profitability. At the end of the day, that's our ultimate goal. So the best model I can use to illustrate this would be hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, or HBS, in dairy cows. You know, by definition, it's a syndrome, not a disease. There is a difference. I had the privilege of about 5 years ago spending a weekend locked in a conference room with about 20 veterinarians and nutritionists that all fed cows across the country. And we actually spent an entire day debating. You would think it was arguing it sometimes, but, you know, passionately debating the difference between syndromes and diseases. And the consensus of the group was a disease has a definitive cause and a definitive result, and you can come up with a definitive treatment. That seems pretty easy. A syndrome, on the other hand, is like a cascade of perfectly timed events that have to happen in concert. And they're unpredictable, and they're not foreseeable, and you can't treat it. And that pretty much describes HBS. High-producing cows that have high intakes go into the parlor for milking, and 6 to 8 hours later, they're dead in the stall with no hint that it ever happened, that was ever going to happen, I should say. Essentially what happens is, if you look at the path analysis of HBS, this graphic pretty much summarizes a lot of published research in a very short, concise manner. But with mycotoxins in the gut alone, you get intestinal damage. poor absorption of feed and lower intakes. When we have mycotoxins in the presence of pathogens, now we have some serious destruction and hemorrhaging of that bowel. So if we're fortunate enough to have a forage, for instance, that is high in mycotoxins or has multiple mycotoxins, and also is salmonella positive or E. coli positive or Clostridia positive, for Clostridia perfringens in particular, we open ourselves up for this type of intestinal destruction and hemorrhaging. Ultimately, death of the animal, sudden death of the animal. However, if we have an opportunity to intervene with refined functional carbohydrate technology, we can keep that gut epithelium sturdy, no dings, no dents, no cracks, and we can also mitigate through binding, and we don't get attachment, we don't see that necrosis, and ultimately we don't see death. So from a resilience perspective, how do we back that up with data? Well, this is some work that basically kind of along that same work I showed earlier, where we're looking at immunosuppression because we know mycotoxins cause that. You know, the Arm & Hammer solution modulated immune response caused by dietary mycotoxins. We specifically looked at TLR2 and 4. Those are membrane protein receptors. They're on certain cells and they recognize foreign substances that pass, and they pass appropriate signals to the immune system that these substances are present. So in other words, these are kind of like the doorman at a nightclub. You're not getting in. They will, you're not getting in if you don't pay the cover charge. They are alerting the entire system. And when they alert the system, as it's mentioned in this bullet point, the immune system, that automatically starts a burn of energy. Okay, the immune system doesn't activate itself for free. That's energy that could be going towards productivity. What we can show you here in this data is that when we supplemented with BG Max, we can restore that immunity and keep these animals free from infection. So if we look at the mRNA expression of these membrane protein receptors on the vertical, and again, same theme, more is better. If you look at TLR2, the gray is the control diet. We add mycotoxins. Now, again, these numbers increase. That means there's more of these proteins, which is a bad thing. More of these proteins, it's the exact opposite of the previous conversation. More of these proteins means we're burning energy. We've tripped the alarm on the immune system. Okay, you can see they go up. They go up in concentration in the presence of mycotoxins. When we come back in and intervene with BG Max, they drop back down. Same thing's true with TLR4. You control diet, you add mycotoxin to that mix, you take a look at the mRNA expression of these membrane protein receptors, they go up. Okay, when you add the Arm & Hammer solution, again, precipitous drop. I get questions all the time. My base training is in reproductive management, dairy business management. So zearalenone is the thing I've been dealing with for a long time in my career, relative to reproductive performance in dairy cattle. And it's the most detrimental mycotoxin to reproductive performance in livestock. Beef, dairy, swine, it's an issue. Data would show that our solution is 80% effective in dairy diets. And when we take a look at in direct comparison to another product that would make those types of competitor claims, both at a pH, a rumen pH and a hind gut pH. So in other words, a pH of 6.5 and a pH of 3. It's independent of pH. You can see that there's quite a bit of efficacy there relative to the Arm & Hammer solution, and this whole idea of not just preventing, but then also protecting the gut and building resiliency. So as we wind down, I'm going to finish up with a couple of graphics that we started with. So again, when mycotoxins are present, oxidative stress, tissue damage increases the permeability of the gut wall, makes the animal more susceptible to secondary infection, reduced performance. When mycotoxins in the Arm & Hammer solution BG Max are introduced, again, we're talking about our bioactive refined functional carbohydrates in combination with a highly refined bentonite. You can see that we have less oxidative stress and tissue damage. We have a maintenance of gut integrity, and that permeability is decreased. And we've got hard data to show that with our protein studies, our gut barrier function proteins. Less toxins have the opportunity to migrate to organs. Secondary infections become less of an issue. The animal can deal with those more effectively on her own if she's not diverting energy to dealing with these mycotoxins. We can restore immunity and hopefully improve our performance. So I mentioned when I started that this solution all came about through innovative conversations with nutritionists across the country. This is a checklist of, when we asked them, what's the perfect mycotoxin solution look like? And in no particular order, they said, well, it's efficacious. It's got to prevent these mycotoxins at different concentrations, right? Prevent that cellular damage. It's got to prevent the risk of the mycotoxins from entering the food chain, as I illustrated with the aflatoxin contaminated milk study. We've got to protect against mycotoxin secondary challenges from pathogens. They acknowledge that there are pathogen challenges in their feeds, particularly Salmonella, E. coli, and Clostridia. We have to build that animal's resilience and help build the immune system or enhance it. Now, we can do those first four things. We got the best science in the world or make the best widget, but if it's too pricey and doesn't have a good ROI, it's irrelevant. And they told us that loud and clear. Got to be a cost-effective solution, and it's got to be easy to use without restriction or regulation. So, again, the tool that, as a result of this feedback that was developed at Arm & Hammer, is branded BG Max, but it's a GRAS product, totally free regulation. It's a very cost-effective solution on a dairy basis. It costs about 5 cents a cow a day to prevent, protect, and build resilience and fit that unmet need of the nutritionist. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn on my camera and answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We do have several questions in the chat box. Let's start with Mike ask, what level of product is typically fed to prevent versus treatment, and what is the cost per cow per day?
Yeah, so we don't go from a treatment mentality with this. Based on the earlier part of the presentation, I think we made the case that this has got to be a 24/7, 365-day type of an intervention. So we're looking at, I guess, what I would call prevention or maintenance. It's 28 grams per head per day, and it costs about 5 cents.
Okay. Jeff asks, how much more exposure of DON may be happening to dairy cows compared with Anaflex? What does the impact difference look like?
It's going to be a tough question to answer. In general, I think the folks that work in this area every day and that are experts, which I am not, but I would tell you the folks that we network with that are experts in this whole mycotoxin conversation would tell you that DON is probably the key to the whole thing. If you could control DON, the rest of these would be fairly easy to take care of. DON is probably higher exposure due to the forages in dairy versus other species, and that survey I showed you earlier bears that out. Aflatoxin, on the other hand, that is actually the one mycotoxin that's more linked to grain than forage. The rest of them are pretty much equal opportunity nuisances, for lack of a better term. But aflatoxin tends to come in on grain. So high moisture corn, ground corn, corn grain, those tend to be the highest opportunity for aflatoxin exposure.
Dr. Pankowski, we've got a question. Is BG Max clay-based material?
It's a again, it's a refined functional carbohydrate, so it's got bioactive beta glucans, moss, and mannose combined with a highly refined, finely ground bentonite. So just to give you some idea on the bentonite, it's guaranteed to be no more than 75 microns, and it's about 75% of its spectite content. So that means it has high affinity for the linear type mycotoxins, as an example, aflatoxin. So it's not a bulky sodium, unrefined sodium bentonite type clay product, no, by any stretch. It's a highly refined source of bentonite, and kind of plays into that conversation I had earlier about yeast products. The more intensity that's put into manufacturing these added value products, the more benefit that the cow gets. So feeding straight bentonite at high feeding rates is going to be much less beneficial and have a less return on investment than feeding some of these higher end products.
Okay, from the same person, what is the effect on vitamin and mineral absorption?
I can't give you a clear answer on that because we don't have any clear data on that. I mean, I would tell you this: if we have a compromised gut, the level of absorption of all nutrients is going to be decreased dramatically. So if we can maintain that gut integrity, I think we got a much better chance of having better nutrient absorption across the board.
Okay. Connor asks, referring back to the map of concentrations of mycotoxins, is there a reason why North America would be higher than, say, Russia?
I would tell you a couple things. Climatology has a lot to do with it, and the number of samples. I'd have to go back to the map because I don't know the numbers memorized, but you could have some variation in that because of the number of samplings by region. Number one, statistically, that's one reason. But then, biologically speaking, climatology. Before this call started, Fred and I were talking about the differences in corn silage harvest throughout the Great Lakes states and the upper Midwest. I mean, we're going to have everything from perfect forage to high fiber to corn that's not filled out because of drought, corn that got planted late because of heavy rain in April. This is going to be 2025 forage, corn silage in particular, in the dairy states in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region is going to be highly variable this year. So that will drive mycotoxin loads also. Again, a lot of the mycotoxin data is based on the climatology, weather. There's certain things you can control during the harvest phase, during the storage phase, but you can't control what goes on in that field while that plant's growing.
Would some of this be that there are countries that just don't put the energy into doing the testing?
That's exactly right. I mean, you'll see there are several countries there that had no samples submitted. There either wasn't an effort to get them, or there wasn't samples to be had, or they just don't care. You just don't know the answer to that. But yeah, I mean, even in the U.S., we know that they're present. But still, when I talk to producers, you'll get the old, yeah, but I just don't see that it's really bothering my cows that much. We got loads; they're used to it. They've been on it for a while. It's like that's not the case. We've actually become accustomed to that level of production. We've made ourselves accustomed to that level of productivity. The best analogy I can give you, you get aware of something and you just become used to it. I would say 10 years ago in New York, it was very common to have Holsteins at 3.5 fat, while the upper Midwest was closer to 4. We had 6-year-old barns and overcrowding, and everybody was, yeah, that's a cost of doing business. Not the case. I'd be hard pressed to find a herd, a well-managed herd in the state of New York right now that's below 4% in fat. It took a long time for people to realize that you cannot be complacent or accept the status quo. And I think that's what we're trying to do here with this solution, is take it to the next level and go beyond the status quo and show a good return on investment.
Is there a map or visual chart of concentrations in North America by state or province?
That I'm unaware of. I'll put a plug in for our friends at DSM. If anybody would have it, they probably have the most robust sampling. My guess is it's possible, but then the problem becomes very similar to the comment we were talking earlier about Russia. Is all, numbers of samples. I'm not quite sure what the variation calculations would be on a sample size calculation, but you'd have to have enough samples to make a state relevant, for instance, to make a conclusion to compare one to the other. I have no doubt that there's probably enough samples in their main dairy states. California, Wisconsin, New York, Michigan, no question, Idaho. I see right there, page is on. They do have state maps, but it's limited number of samples. Thanks. That's awesome. So yeah, it's just kind of what I suspected. It's going to come back to sample size before you can make those leaps of faith and say that one area's got a bigger problem than the other.
Very good. And thank you, Paige. We appreciate the heads up on that. Happy asked kind of a management type question. How is BG Max used? Is it mixed with the feed, mixed with the forage? Just give us a short, here's how you use it.
Yeah, it's available at your feed manufacturer. It would come mixed from the mill. It's a small enough inclusion product that you would want to have it mixed at a mill where you're limiting your opportunity for shrink and loss of product. So yeah, your nutritionist would put it in the ration, and it would be available at the mill.
Very good. Well, I'll give a little bit of information, and then we'll ask for a final take-home message or take-home comment. Joel, I want to remind everybody that this program is recorded and will be on the webpage for the Four-State Dairy and Management Conference. Give us 3-4 days for that to happen, and you will receive a notification from me when an email from me when it is up, and I will include a link for a short webinar. We're still pretty new at putting these out with the Four-State group. It's a short 5-question webinar. Please answer them. That gives us some pretty good feedback on what we can do to make this even better. Dr. Pankowski, tell us, what's your final reminder for producers?
Well, I think overall, number one, mycotoxins exist. They're not monsters under the bed. They're there. We have to admit that they're there. We have to then figure out and realize that they do have detrimental effects to our wallets at the end of the day. Obviously, the cow health is the most important thing, but at the end of the day, we spend a lot of time taking care of these animals to make sure that we can provide a good living for our family. So you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make sure the cow's healthy and productivity is optimal. And then lastly, times change quick. Science turns over very quickly. There's advances every day. Be open-minded to new things, and be open-minded to the whole idea of return on investment, marginal investments. In a lot of cases, if you take a look at what your nutritionist is already doing, there's opportunities for swap outs and costing advantages with some of these new technologies. As again, the last thing I'll say is remember the concept of the higher the intensity of the manufacturing, the more functional the end product's going to be. That product usually comes in a smaller package, and because of the intensity and the advances in manufacturing, it usually comes in a smaller package. So has a lot of neat implications, reductions in freight, opens up dry matter space. So I guess the overall theme is, I think you saw something today that's new and novel. Uh, be open-minded to it, give it a try, and always make sure that when you're evaluating these types of options that you're asking for published literature, not marketing pieces. Published literature will ensure that the money you're spending has a pretty decent chance of return and use of profit.
Joel, thank you again for putting the program together and presenting it to us. A very novel idea, and we appreciate you getting it out for producers. I'll look forward to seeing folks attend next month's program. At this point, I'm going to close the program.